The judge's voice rang out clearly in the courtroom, $500 for contempt of court. It must be paid before you leave today. This was the penalty imposed on a black female attorney for unintentionally arriving late to the hearing. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew increasingly tense as the attorney stood resolutely, her hands resting on the podium. She thought to herself that she had never heard of anyone being fined for tardiness like this before. A short while later, the situation became clearer. Several others arrived late, but they were merely reminded by the judge without facing any penalties. The only shared characteristic among them, they were all white. There was something discriminatory at play here. The black female attorney felt frustrated by being publicly reprimanded and treated unfairly. She resolved to confront and expose the judge's bias. Let us reflect on this true story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more daily stories like this. Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. The morning light poured through the tall windows of a modest apartment in South Chicago. The apartment was simple yet meticulously organized, with shelves lined with law books and neatly stacked case files on a sleek glass desk in the corner. Camille Bennett, a 34-year-old black attorney, moved quietly as she prepared for her workday. The faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the crisp scent of eucalyptus diffused from a small device in the living room. Camille stood by her wardrobe, carefully selecting her outfit for the day, a tailored charcoal blazer, a crisp white blouse, and black tailored trousers. She adjusted a simple silver necklace in the mirror, her brown eyes scanning her reflection with calm determination. With one hand holding her coffee cup, she opened her phone to a reminder about a 9 a.m. court appearance at the city courthouse. Today's case wasn't high profile, just a contested parking ticket. Yet, even for something so minor, Camille prepared as thoroughly as she would for a major trial. A folder containing photographs of parking signs and her written appeal was ready in her work bag. She smiled softly, picked up her bag, and headed toward the door. Slipping on her black heels, she adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder before leaving the apartment. The city was just waking up as Camille stepped outside. The winter air bit at her skin, but she walked briskly toward the parking lot where her sleek silver Honda Creve awaited. She stepped inside, escaping the biting cold, fastened her seatbelt, and turned on some calming music to start her day. Driving through the bustling streets, her mind organized her thoughts for the day ahead. The roads were clear, and Camille glanced at the clock on her dashboard, 8:15 a.m., plenty of time to park and reach the courtroom. However, her focus shifted when a notification popped up on her phone. This time, it was an email from her firm, marked urgent. Camille pulled over onto a quiet side street to read the email. It was a last-minute update on a case she had consulted on. Her fingers danced over her laptop keyboard as she drafted a reply, her mind analyzing legal arguments. Time slipped away unnoticed, her focus unbroken, until she glanced at the clock, 8:50 a.m. The courthouse was still 10 minutes away, and parking would be another challenge. Camille shut her laptop and got back on the road, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. She had never been late to court before, and the thought went against every principle she upheld. But the urgency of the email had been unavoidable. Driving through the streets, a slight furrow formed between her brows, the only outward sign of the stress she felt. The courthouse loomed ahead, its neoclassical columns casting long shadows over the morning crowd streaming into the building. Camille checked the time on her dashboard, 8:58 a.m. A flicker of anxiety crossed her face as she scanned for parking spots on the surrounding streets. Every space seemed taken, with digital parking meters flashing red in silent rejection. Her breath puffed into the chilly morning air as she finally spotted a tight space near a side lot a block away. Pulling her car into the narrow spot, she grabbed her bag and stepped out. The icy wind stung her cheeks as she pulled her coat tightly around herself. Not far away, a sharply dressed white woman with a briefcase full of documents strode quickly toward the courthouse. Camille thought to herself, maybe I'm not the only one running late today. Glancing at her watch, 9:03 a.m., she quickened her pace, knowing time was slipping away. The courthouse doors creaked open as Camille slipped inside, her movements quick but composed. The security line wasn't long, but each beep of the metal detector felt like a countdown to disaster. Her bag went through the scanner, and she passed through the detector, of course, without issue. Camille made her way down the marble-floored hallway toward the courtroom, the sound of her heels echoing off the high ceilings. She rehearsed her points in her mind, her lawyer's instincts organizing her arguments. The faint murmur of activity grew louder as she approached Courtroom 5, where Judge Ronald Green presided. Reaching for the door handle, she paused for a moment to take a steadying breath. Camille prided herself on her professionalism, and despite being late, she was determined to handle the situation with grace. But as she pushed the door open and stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The courtroom was already in session, the wooden benches nearly full with a mix of defendants clutching papers, lawyers flipping through case files, and a handful of observers. Judge Green, seated high on the bench, was mid-sentence, addressing another case. His sharp voice carried an air of authority, each word precisely enunciated. As Camille entered, his words halted. His piercing gaze turned toward her, his eyes narrowing in annoyance. "Step forward," Judge Green barked, his voice cutting through the quiet murmur of the room. Camille froze momentarily, the weight of every eye in the room suddenly falling on her. She walked toward the bench with measured steps, maintaining a straight posture and a neutral expression. "You must be Ms. Bennett," Judge Green said coldly. "Scheduled for 9 a.m. It is now." He glanced at the clock on the wall, his lips pressing into a thin line. 9:09. Camille opened her mouth to explain, but the judge raised a hand to silence her. "This courtroom operates on time, Ms. Bennett," he continued, his voice rising. "Do you believe your time is more valuable than the court's?" The room tensed. Camille felt the weight of the audience's stares, some curious, others sympathetic. She noticed a man in a suit, sitting in the back a defendant. She guessed smirking slightly, clearly enjoying the spectacle. "Your Honor," Camille began, her voice calm yet respectful, "I apologize for the delay. I was..." "An apology?" Judge Green interrupted, shuffling papers on his desk. "This is not a casual meeting where you can stroll in as you please. This is a court of law." Camille clenched her jaw, though her expression remained composed. She could feel her pulse quicken, but she knew better than to show it. Behind her, the sharply dressed white woman she'd seen in the parking lot, who must have arrived just minutes before Camille, sat quietly flipping through her papers. Judge Green leaned forward in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. "Perhaps a fine will remind you of the importance of punctuality," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. $500 for contempt of court. Payable before you leave today." The murmurs in the room grew louder, only to be silenced by a sharp rap of the gavel. Camille stood still, her hands resting lightly on the podium. The fine wasn't about the money, it was about the principle. Yes, she had been late, but this punishment felt personal rather than procedural. This tardiness was one she would not forget. The tension in the room was palpable as Judge Green prepared to move on to the next case. But Camille wasn't done. Not yet. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady yet carrying a quiet authority. "May I have a moment to address the court?" Judge Green eyed her, irritated but curious. "Proceed," he said, waving a dismissive hand. Camille took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the edge of the podium. "This is no longer just about a parking ticket. This is about something much larger." Judge Green directed a sharp glare at Camille, his expression hardening. The fine had been issued, and his gavel rested within easy reach, a silent reminder of his authority. The air in the courtroom grew heavier with each passing second as tension mounted. Camille glanced momentarily at the clock, 9:14 a.m., just as the judge flipped through the next case file, as though dismissing her entirely. "Your Honor," Camille resumed, her voice calm but unwavering, "with all due respect, I would like to clarify." "You are not permitted," Judge Green interrupted, his voice slicing through hers like a knife. "We have wasted enough time. Pay the fine and sit down." The sharp refusal echoed through the room, pressing an invisible weight onto everyone present. Camille took a deep breath, resisting the surge of frustration building in her chest. This wasn't just about a parking ticket anymore. It was about the blatant disparity unfolding before her. The contrast in treatment was undeniable. Just minutes ago, Camille had watched a white man in a tailored suit stumble into the courtroom 7 minutes late, mumbling an excuse about traffic. Judge Green barely glanced at him before waving him off with a dismissive, "Just make sure you're on time next time." Yet here she stood, a black woman, calm, prepared, and professional, being publicly reprimanded, humiliated, and fined. The punishment wasn't about tardiness, it was a clear display of power, an intentional effort to belittle her. Behind her, the white woman she'd seen earlier at the parking lot now sat quietly, flipping through her documents, pretending not to notice the disparity. Her pristine, composed demeanor starkly contrasted Camille's current position, a poised professional reduced to public spectacle. "Respectfully, Your Honor," Camille said again, her voice firm yet measured. "I must point out that my case is being handled differently than others presented here this morning. I am requesting fairness in this courtroom." Judge Green's face flushed slightly, and he gripped his gavel tightly. "Fairness?" he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You want to talk about fairness, Ms. Bennett? How fair is it to disrupt court proceedings because you couldn't bother to arrive on time?" A murmur rippled through the room. Camille could feel the weight of the judge's words pressing down on her, but she stood her ground. Years of experience had taught her how to navigate imbalances of power without losing her composure. She raised her chin slightly, her eyes meeting his directly. "Your Honor," she replied steadily, "I assure you, my delay was due to pressing professional obligations that required my immediate attention. I apologize for the tardiness, but I respectfully ask the court to consider the context of my delay before imposing a disproportionate penalty." The room grew tenser. Mrs. Turner, the court clerk, resumed typing, her fingers trembling slightly as she documented the exchange. She glanced briefly at Camille, her lips pressing into a thin line as though debating whether to speak up. Meanwhile, the older black man sitting in the audience shook his head, a small but clear gesture of solidarity. Judge Green leaned forward in his chair, his tone lowering into a cold growl. "Whatever the reason, Ms. Bennett, tardiness is no excuse for contempt. Pay the fine, or I will ensure this matter escalates further." For the first time, Camille's calm demeanor wavered slightly. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she weighed her options. The issue wasn't the fine itself, it was the precedent it set. The quiet injustice of unequal treatment lingered like a storm cloud over the courtroom, visible to everyone but openly acknowledged by no one. Camille exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening on the edge of the podium before releasing. "Understood, Your Honor," she finally said, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of defiance. Judge Green scowled, his expression hardening, but he said nothing further. His gavel came down again, and he moved on to the next case. As Camille stepped away from the podium, she could feel the stares of the other defendants and observers trailing her. She was no longer just a late arrival. She was someone who had dared to challenge the system. What Judge Green didn't realize was that every word, tone, and action had been meticulously recorded in Camille's sharp mind. This wasn't the end of the matter. It was only the beginning. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Camille stood silently, her back straight and her face unreadable, as Judge Green turned his attention to the next case. But even as she moved to retake her seat, her mind raced. The disparity she had just witnessed, the casual dismissal of white defendants' tardiness versus the public chastisement she endured, was glaring, and the sharp contrast weighed heavily on her. At that moment, the court clerk, Mrs. Turner, called the next name, David Harris, a middle-aged white businessman in an expensive gray suit. He rose from his seat with measured ease, carrying a polished leather briefcase, and approached the podium with the practiced comfort of someone who believed they had nothing to fear. Camille watched, her legal instincts attuned to every detail. David had been late, at least 7 minutes. She had seen him enter the courtroom just minutes before her, looking flustered but immediately blending into the crowd with the confidence of someone certain they would face no consequences. "Mr. Harris," Judge Green said, his tone suddenly softer, almost disinterested. "Here regarding your traffic violation last month." "Yes, Your Honor," David replied, his tone measured. "Apologies for being late. Traffic downtown was terrible this morning." He offered a faint smile. The judge barely looked up. "Just make sure it doesn't happen again," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Let's proceed." Camille's jaw tightened imperceptibly, her hands resting on her lap as she stared straight ahead. The blatant difference in tone and treatment hit her like a punch to the chest. No scolding, no fine, not even a hint of displeasure from Judge Green. For being late, just as she had been, David Harris was met with understanding and leniency, his delay dismissed as an unavoidable inconvenience rather than a personal failing. The older black man sitting nearby, Walter Freeman, shook his head slightly. He leaned forward and whispered just loudly enough for Camille to hear, "Same story, different day." His tone carried both resignation and simmering anger. Camille glanced at him briefly, their eyes meeting in a silent acknowledgement of shared experience. As the proceedings continued, another latecomer entered the courtroom, a young white woman in her 20s, holding a stack of papers. She hurried to find a seat, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Judge Green, in the middle of addressing another defendant, didn't even pause. Camille's mind raced as she observed these interactions. For white defendants, lateness was a forgivable oversight, at worst a minor inconvenience. But for her, a black woman, professional and prepared, tardiness was an affront to authority, a breach of decorum deserving not just reprimand but financial punishment. The breaking point came when a third defendant was called to the podium. Sophia Caldwell, the young white woman who had arrived late. Nervously, she explained her infraction, her voice trembling slightly as she apologized for her delay. Judge Green offered a faint smile. "It's all right, Miss Caldwell. We understand mornings can be tough. Let's move on to your case, shall we?" Camille felt a knot of frustration tighten in her stomach. The same judge who had berated her in front of the entire courtroom, who had fined her $500 without allowing her a proper explanation, now displayed empathy and understanding for someone else, simply because they didn't look like her. As the hearing continued, Camille's resolve hardened. She hadn't just witnessed unequal treatment, she had lived it. Years of legal training and practice had taught her to recognize systemic bias when she saw it, and today's events were a textbook example. Mrs. Turner, still typing quietly at her desk, seemed to hesitate briefly, glancing toward Camille. There was a flicker of guilt in her expression, as though she, too, saw the pattern unfolding but felt powerless to intervene. At one point, Judge Green's gaze flickered toward Camille, his eyes briefly registering irritation, or perhaps acknowledgement of her continued presence. Camille met his gaze, her expression unwavering. The room grew heavier, the tension palpable as the proceedings carried on. Walter Freeman shifted in his seat, his hands clasped tightly together. Camille could sense that others in the room, defendants and observers alike, were beginning to notice the disparities too. When the session finally adjourned, Camille rose from her seat, gathering her belongings with deliberate calm. She could feel the weight of what had transpired pressing down on her. But rather than defeat, she felt a spark of determination. The condescending tone of Judge Green, the smirks of a few defendants, and the complicit silence of others had ignited a growing fire within her. The courtroom had thinned out as some cases concluded and defendants exited, but Camille Bennett remained seated, her back straight and her expression resolute. Judge Green, still presiding from his lofty bench, appeared unmoved, his authority as polished as his black robe. His gavel rested lightly in his hand, a symbol of the power he wielded, indifferent to the lives it impacted. Camille's mind raced as she calculated her next move. As the next case concluded, Camille stood, adjusting her blazer with quiet confidence. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she approached the podium. The room quieted slightly, curious eyes following her purposeful movements. Judge Green glanced up, visibly annoyed. "Miss Bennett," he said, his tone cutting, "this matter has been resolved. You've been fined for your tardiness. Is there something else?" "Yes, Your Honor," Camille replied, her voice steady. "I would like to clarify certain points with the court and ensure the record accurately reflects the events of this morning." The judge's eyebrows knitted together, his irritation clear. "This is highly irregular," he said, "but proceed, briefly." Camille set her bag on the podium and reached inside, withdrawing a sleek leather folder. She opened it deliberately, the golden seal of the Bar Association catching the sunlight streaming through the courtroom windows. Then she began, her voice calm but commanding. "For the record, Your Honor, my name is Camille Bennett. I am a licensed attorney specializing in civil rights law, currently representing multiple cases addressing systemic bias in both the public and private sectors." The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Green's eyes widened slightly before narrowing. His lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing. Around the room, subtle shifts in posture betrayed the rising tension. Even Mrs. Turner, the court clerk, paused mid-typing, her fingers hovering above the keys. "I understand that this courtroom operates under rules," Camille continued, her gaze unwavering. "I understand the importance of punctuality and respect for judicial proceedings. However, I must question the consistency in how these rules are applied." Her words hung in the air, each syllable sharp and deliberate. Judge Green's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of his bench, his authority now visibly shaken. "For instance," Camille said, her voice rising just enough to carry across the room, "a defendant who arrived after me this morning received nothing more than a polite reminder. No reprimand, no fine. Yet I was subjected to excessive chastisement in front of the court and fined $500 without even being given the opportunity to explain." Several audience members shifted in their seats, exchanging glances. Walter Freeman, the older black man seated near the back, leaned forward, his eyes alight with admiration and vindication. He had witnessed countless moments of injustice in his lifetime, but rarely had he seen someone stand up to it so boldly. Judge Green's face flushed red. "Miss Bennett," he began, his tone sharp, "I will not tolerate." "With all due respect, Your Honor," Camille interjected, her voice slicing through his like a scalpel, "this is not about tolerance. This is about fairness. This is about ensuring that everyone who enters this courtroom is treated with the same dignity, regardless of race, gender, or perceived status." Her words landed like a hammer. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, and Mrs. Turner resumed typing, this time with an urgency that suggested she was determined to capture every word. "Let me be clear," Camille said, her tone even but filled with conviction. "This is not just about me. This is about systemic patterns that we all know exist but rarely acknowledge. Patterns where individuals like me are held to higher standards and punished more severely, while others are met with leniency and understanding." Judge Green glanced toward the corner of the room, his gaze briefly flickering to Mrs. Turner as if hoping for an interruption, but none came. Camille continued, her voice steady yet charged with righteous determination. "Your Honor," she said, locking eyes with him, "I have spent my career fighting for equality under the law. And today I see that even in this courtroom, bias can color decisions, whether consciously or unconsciously. I respectfully request that this court re-examine its practices and uphold the principle that justice must not only be done but must also be seen to be done." The room fell silent again. Judge Green stared at Camille for a long moment, his mouth opening as if to retort, but no words came. Instead, he cleared his throat, shuffled the papers on his desk, and leaned back in his chair, his authority visibly diminished. "Ms. Bennett," he finally said, his voice quieter now, "your concerns are noted. This court will review its procedures." "Thank you, Your Honor," Camille said, inclining her head slightly. "For the record, I will be filing a formal complaint with the Judicial Review Board. Transparency is the cornerstone of trust in our legal system." Judge Green gave a curt nod, his face pale. As Camille stepped away from the podium, the room erupted in whispers. Walter Freeman, unable to contain his pride, clapped once loudly before quickly quieting himself. Camille returned to her seat, her expression calm but resolute. She knew this was not the end, it was the beginning. Today she had planted a seed of accountability, and its roots would stretch far beyond the walls of this courtroom. The courtroom began to empty, but Camille remained seated for a moment longer, her thoughts racing. This was no longer just about a parking ticket. It was about confronting a system that had perpetuated bias for far too long. As she left the courtroom, the fire inside her burned brighter. Justice was not just an ideal, it was something to fight for, case by case, day by day. Months passed since Camille Bennett's confrontation in Judge Green's courtroom, and the ripples of that fateful day continued to spread through Chicago's legal system. What began as a singular act of defiance had evolved into a citywide reckoning, forcing long overdue reforms. Judge Green sat in his home office, the weight of the investigation heavy on his shoulders. The Judicial Review Board had reached its conclusions, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Public pressure and media scrutiny left him with two options: quietly resign or face formal disciplinary hearings. After days of deliberation, he chose to step down, a decision that brought relief and a sense of justice to those who had witnessed his bias. In a statement released to the press, Judge Green declared, "I never intended to discriminate, and I deeply regret if my actions were interpreted otherwise." His words rang hollow to many, but his removal marked a significant shift in a system that had long shielded individuals like him from accountability. The investigation did not end with Judge Green's resignation. With public support behind them, the Judicial Review Board announced sweeping reforms to address systemic bias within the court system. Among the changes were: 1. Mandatory annual training. All judges and court staff were required to attend yearly sessions on recognizing and mitigating implicit bias. These training sessions featured real-world scenarios and testimonials from individuals affected by discriminatory practices. 2. Detailed record keeping. Courts were now required to maintain comprehensive records of fines, sentencing disparities, and courtroom behavior, with independent committees conducting quarterly audits to ensure fairness. 3. Citizen oversight committees. Local residents, including civil rights advocates, legal professionals, and community leaders, were invited to serve on oversight panels, providing a direct channel for addressing complaints and ensuring greater accountability. 4. Defendant support initiatives. New programs were introduced to provide defendants with access to legal counsel, financial assistance for fines, and guidance throughout the trial process, reducing systemic barriers that disproportionately affected minority communities. For Camille, life had transformed dramatically. What began as an infuriating courtroom encounter became a defining moment in her career. She emerged as a prominent voice for reform, not just in Chicago but nationwide. Her inbox overflowed with invitations to speak at conferences, law schools, and community events. At one forum, she addressed a packed auditorium of young law students, recounting the day she stood up to Judge Green. "Justice is not a privilege reserved for the powerful," she said, her voice steady and impassioned. "It is a right that must be fiercely protected for everyone, regardless of race, background, or status." Camille also collaborated with legal organizations to establish a network for attorneys and defendants to report instances of bias. The platform, aptly named Justice Watch, allowed users to document their experiences anonymously, creating a growing database of evidence for systemic change. Walter Freeman, the older black man who had been present in Judge Green's courtroom that day, became a local advocate for judicial reform. He joined one of the newly established oversight committees, working closely with other members to ensure that the changes were not merely words on paper. "I've seen what happens when people stay silent," Walter said at a town hall meeting. "But I've also seen what happens when someone speaks up." Camille showed us that change is possible, and now it's up to us to make sure that change lasts. The impact of Camille's stand reverberated beyond the legal system. Conversations about implicit bias and systemic injustice began to take root in workplaces, schools, and community spaces. Local businesses and organizations initiated diversity and inclusion programs inspired by the court's reforms. Social media played a crucial role in sustaining the momentum. The hashtag #EqualJusticeNow trended for weeks, amplifying stories of individuals who faced similar injustices. Camille's story became a rallying cry for those demanding accountability and fairness in every facet of life. While Judge Green's resignation marked the end of his judicial career, his story did not entirely fade away. In a surprising turn, he began attending bias training sessions as a participant, seeking to understand the harm his decisions had caused. At one session, he stood before a room of judges and confessed, "I thought I was impartial, but I see now that ignorance is no excuse. I let my assumptions guide me, and for that I take full responsibility." While some saw his actions as too little, too late, others viewed them as a sign that even those entrenched in the system could change when confronted with the truth. 6 months after Judge Green's resignation, the courthouse where it all began hosted a public forum to celebrate the implementation of the reforms. Camille was invited as the keynote speaker. Standing at the same podium where she had once been fined and humiliated, she addressed a crowd of lawyers, judges, and community members. "Change is not easy," Camille began, her voice firm. "It requires persistence, courage, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But change is possible. What we've done here in Chicago can become a model for cities across the country. This is just the beginning." The crowd erupted into applause, and Camille allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. She had fought against injustice and won, not just for herself, but for countless others silenced by a flawed system. Outside the courthouse, a new plaque had been installed. It bore a simple yet powerful inscription: Justice is not a privilege. It is a right. Let this place stand as a reminder that fairness is the foundation of freedom. Below the inscription was a single date, the day Camille Bennett stood against systemic bias and changed everything. Join the movement for justice. Subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and make these stories a part of your daily life. Together we can create real change.